As a child, Mark Twitchell had always dreamed of becoming a big-time Hollywood filmmaker. But he knew the odds were stacked against him because he lived in Edmonton, Canada, which was not exactly known for being a movie-making hub. Nonetheless, after high school, he enrolled in an Edmonton art college, and in 2000, he graduated, earning his degree in radio and television art. But after college, despite utilizing his training to make several films, none of them generated any buzz beyond his friends and family, and so it seemed like his filmmaking career was turning into a bit of a dud. However, in 2007, Mark had a bit of an unintentional breakthrough. He had been a longtime Star Wars fanatic, and that year he decided, purely as a passion project, he was going to write a script for a prequel to the Star Wars franchise. When he finished it and shared the script with some of his colleagues, they were so impressed with his writing, they said, "Mark, you need to produce this into a movie. This is incredible." And so Mark, who was totally amazed at this unbelievable feedback he was getting, decided, you know what the heck, I will produce this movie. And so he began sending his script out to different actors and actresses to see if they might be interested in playing a role. And amazingly, one of the original Star Wars actors, Jeremy Bulloch, who played Boba Fett, he read the script and he was so impressed by it that he agreed to play a role in Mark's film. And so this passion project had quickly turned into Mark's biggest success yet. When the movie was finished, it did well, but it didn't propel Mark into Hollywood stardom. However, it did put him on the map as a bona fide filmmaker, and it showed him that if he just focused on making films about subjects he was already very passionate about, those films would be much more likely to succeed. And so in 2008, so roughly a year after creating the Star Wars fan fiction film, Mark decided to embark on another film project around another passion of his, Dexter. Dexter was a very popular TV show about a fictional serial killer whose name was Dexter, and the way Dexter would kill his victims is he would lure them into these small rooms, which he called kill rooms, and inside of them, basically every surface, the ceiling, the walls, the floor, were all covered in plastic sheeting to catch any of the blood, and then he would kill his victims, usually with a knife, and then afterwards he would dismember them and bag up their body, and he would roll up all this plastic, kind of collecting all the evidence, and then he would dump the plastic and the body into the ocean. Mark was obsessed with the show, and so it inspired him to make his next movie be about a killer too. Except instead of it being fiction like Dexter, he wanted his movie to be at least based on real events. And it just so happened, at the time he was thinking about doing this movie, there was this uncaught murderer terrorizing Edmonton, and so Mark decided the Edmonton killer would be his star. Mark would spend the next several weeks obsessively researching the Edmonton killer and his victims and establishing a clear timeline of what had happened with this case, and then after he felt like he had compiled every piece of information he possibly could, he used that research to concoct a 42-page first draft of his script. And as soon as he was done with that first draft, it somehow got leaked. And when it got leaked, the contents of this script were so shocking and so controversial that the script wound up in the hands of the Edmonton police. And when they read the script, they immediately recognized they had a big problem. They reached out to Mark and they told him under no circumstances can you turn this script into a movie, and then the police basically wiped this script off the face of the earth. Today, if you go looking for Mark's script online, you'll basically only find heavily censored versions of it. But recently, I got my hands on an uncensored version of this 42-page script. Now, I'm not going to literally read you this script. However, what I'm going to do is use the script's information to tell you Mark's highly controversial Edmonton killer story. As you listen, remember this story is based on actual events, and so the victims' names and the information about them is real. Okay, here we go. In early October 2008, a soft-spoken 26-year-old casino security guard named Giles Tetreault was living alone in Edmonton. Giles's life had recently been turned upside down because a few months earlier, his wife had told him that she just didn't love him anymore and that she was going to leave him. Giles was still very much in love with his wife, and so this was a totally heartbreaking experience for him. After she left, Giles tried to stay busy and keep his mind occupied, but it rarely worked. Oftentimes, he felt crushingly lonely and sad. But on Friday, October 3rd, when Giles came home from work that afternoon, he suddenly felt like, you know what, I gotta get my life together, and I'm gonna start by finding myself a new romantic partner. And so he went on a dating site and he made himself a profile, and he began scrolling through all of the women's profiles that lived roughly in his area. And at first, no one really appealed to him, but then he stopped on this one woman's profile. She was this young, blonde, beautiful woman named Sheena, and she lived right in Edmonton. And so Giles thought, what the heck, I'll send her a message. And so he did, just introducing himself and asking to talk further. And she responded just a couple of minutes later. And then over the next couple of hours, the two exchanged dozens of messages, getting to know each other. And then finally, Sheena just says to Giles, hey, we live so close together. Why don't we get together tonight and go grab dinner and watch a movie together? And Giles is thrilled and he says, yeah, I'll come pick you up. What's your address? And Sheena would tell him, you know what? I don't feel comfortable sharing my address over this dating website. And so instead, she sent Giles this strange customized set of directions that didn't give the actual address of her house. Instead, it basically gave Giles a set of known landmarks in Edmonton that he could follow until he finally arrived at her residence. And she also told him that when he arrived, instead of just coming up to her house, there would be a detached garage and the door would be open and he would go through the garage, out the door into her backyard, and then he would go up the back steps to the back door of her house and she would meet him there. Now, Giles did think this was a little bit strange, but at the same time, he's thinking, I am basically a complete stranger to her. We just met today on the internet, and so I really can't blame her for taking some extra safety precautions with me. And so he told Sheena he had no issues using her special directions, and then he said he'd be over soon. And so Giles hopped in the shower, he freshened up, he got dressed, he hopped in his truck, and then he began driving to Sheena's house. After about 15 minutes of following these directions, he reached the end of them, and they placed him in this alleyway in a suburban neighborhood. And where he stopped, he looked off to his right, and he saw there was this 2-car garage, and he knew it was Sheena's garage because one of the doors was open like she said it would be, although the door was not open all the way. It was open enough to where he would have to duck to get into the garage, but either way, he knew it was her garage. And so he turns off his truck, and he gets out, and he tries to look up at Sheena's house behind the garage to see if maybe he can see her looking out the back door, but the detached garage that was right up against the street was kind of blocking his view, and so he thought, okay, whatever, I'll just go in and make my way up to the back steps. And so he walks over to this 2-car garage, and he goes to the open side, he ducks down, and he goes underneath, and he stands up inside of the garage. Now, it was dark inside of the garage, there was no light on, but there was enough light spilling in from the opening of the garage door that he could see there was really nothing in the garage. However, virtually every surface, the walls, the ceiling, the floor, was covered in plastic sheeting. Now, he had no idea what this plastic sheeting was for, and he really didn't care. He just kept walking across the garage towards the door that would lead into Sheena's backyard. And when he reached that door, he reached down to the door handle and he was about to turn it when he felt a blinding pain in the back of his neck. He whipped around, and even though it was dark inside of this garage, he could clearly see this huge man in a black and gold hockey mask standing right in front of him holding a stun baton. Giles tries to run past him to try to get out of the garage, but the man grabs him and then takes his stun baton and drives it into Giles' stomach, and he pulls the trigger. And immediately Giles feels this coursing pain in his torso, and he falls to the ground, and then this man in the mask releases the trigger, and Giles tries to scramble up to his feet to try to run out of the garage. But as soon as Giles turns around, he stops where he is because he sees this huge guy in the mask is standing between him and this open garage door, and he's now holding a gun in his hand and he's aiming it right at Giles. And so Giles freezes. He has no idea what's going on, and this man who's got this mask on barks at Giles to get on the ground and put your face on the ground. And so Giles at this point is thinking, I'm going to get killed in here. I have nothing I can do. I'm completely defenseless here. And so he just does what he's told, and he lies down on the plastic sheeting and he's totally terrified. And this man walks over and he puts a piece of duct tape over Giles's eyes. And so as he's laying there blind and terrified, Giles becomes very emotional. He suddenly longs for his ex-wife and for his family and his friends. He wishes he could see them just one more time, and he knows he's not going to. Then, as he's laying there, he's coming to the stark realization that he didn't tell anyone where he was going. And so if this masked maniac does kill him, Who's gonna find his body? Will his family and friends ever know what happened to him? So as he's laying there thinking of these horrible thoughts, he hears his attacker, who's several feet behind him, start fiddling with what sounds like chains or handcuffs. And Giles thinks to himself, if I get chained up in here, I really am done. And so he has this sudden surge of adrenaline where he thinks to himself, I'm gonna get killed in here. I know it, I'm gonna get killed. But if I'm gonna die, I'm gonna die on my terms. And so Giles takes a deep breath and then jumps to his feet, rips the tape off of his eyes. He turns around and he faces his attacker and he says, I'm not going to do this. I'm not going to go out this way. And the attacker is totally surprised, but he just begins to raise his gun at Giles to shoot him. And Giles lunges forward and he grabs the barrel of the gun and he pushes it away from him. And as soon as he does that, Giles realizes something. The gun is made of plastic. It's fake. And so Giles is suddenly so confident, he grabs the arms of his attacker and he tries to kick the guy in the legs, but the attacker is so much bigger and stronger than Giles that he just headbutts Giles. Giles goes flying to the ground and his attacker jumps on top of him and begins punching him and slamming his skull into the ground. But Giles is so high on adrenaline, he can't feel any of the blows. All he's trying to do this whole time as he's getting pummeled is just find a way to stand up and run out of this garage. Just get out, escape. And amazingly, against all odds, he does manage in between blows to wriggle his way out of the attacker's grasp. But as he begins to run towards that opening in the garage door, the attacker grabs him by the jacket. And so Giles twists himself and he actually comes out of the jacket. And then he throws himself onto the ground and he rolls out of the garage. And as soon as he is free, he suddenly can't stand up. The stun baton, he didn't feel it before, but it had sapped all of his strength. But the adrenaline had kind of overridden that feeling. But here he is outside and he suddenly can't stand up. And so he's trying to stand up, and then the attacker, who's still inside, dives down, reaches out from underneath the garage and grabs Giles by the ankle and begins trying to pull him back into the garage. And so Giles is kicking and screaming and punching, and he finally breaks free. And then he has another surge of adrenaline and he stands up and just begins running down the alleyway. Doesn't even go to his car. He just starts running towards, hopefully, civilization. And he makes it a couple of houses before he collapses to the ground in this very busy walking trail. And so he's landed right in this intersection where he's hoping someone's going to be. He turns back and looks down the alleyway and he sees his attacker, who's now on the road. He's got the mask still on his face and he's charging up the road. Giles can't even get up. He's so tired, but Giles looks to his side and he sees there's this random couple walking down the walking path. They see Giles on the ground who's calling out for help, and they run over to him and they get right in front of Giles, and Giles immediately points at the attacker coming down the alleyway and says, he's trying to kill me. And the attacker amazingly just jogs right up to Giles, right up to the couple. He does not take his mask off and he acts like he's friends with Giles and says, oh, come on, Frank, you're making a big deal out of it. It's a game. Come back to the garage. I'll meet you there. And then the attacker just turns around and walks back down the alleyway back towards his garage. And so Giles turns and looks up at the couple, who are totally freaked out by this whole situation. They don't know if this is some weird setup that they're going to get robbed or something. They don't know if this is a hoax. And so they say, hey, you're on your own, pal. And they turn and they leave. And so Giles is left in the middle of this intersection. The only people that could have helped him are now gone. And so he rolls over and just looks down the alleyway in the direction of the garage. And he can actually see his attacker pacing back and forth inside of the garage because that door is partially open. And so Giles doesn't know what to do. He has to get to his truck to get out of here. And so he just sits there for a couple of seconds, just watching the attacker, making sure he's staying inside of the garage. And then finally, he just took a deep breath. He pulled himself up and he stumbled down the alleyway. He got in his truck, fired it up, and he peeled out of there. When Giles got home, he was obviously traumatized from this horrible thing that had just happened to him, but he also felt embarrassed and kind of ashamed that he had clearly just gotten catfished by the psycho in the garage. Obviously, Sheena, the woman he supposedly was talking to, was not real. It was that guy in the garage that had attacked him, but he didn't really understand why it had happened. He had no idea why anyone would target him, and so the whole situation was just such a mess. He decided, you know what? I'm not going to tell anyone. He didn't report it to the police. He didn't tell his friends. He didn't tell his family. He just decided he was going to move on and forget about it. A week later, on October 8th, another Edmonton man, 38-year-old Johnny Altinger, was perusing the dating website that Giles had been using. Johnny made a living doing quality control for an oil and gas company, but he hated that job. He much preferred to spend his time tinkering with his computers or his prized motorcycle. Johnny had lots of very close friends, but romance was always something that had eluded him. So that afternoon, Johnny, like Giles, was on this dating website to potentially find a romantic partner. And so as he was scrolling through all of these different women's profiles that lived roughly in his area, he wasn't interested in any of them until he stopped on this one profile of this beautiful young blonde woman named Jen, who lived right in Edmonton. And so Johnny was interested. He sent her a message, and very quickly she wrote back, and before long the two are chumming it up, and then eventually they actually agree to get together that night for dinner and a movie. But when Johnny asked Jen for her address, she would tell him that she's a paranoid person and she doesn't want to give him her actual address over this website, and so instead she gave him a set of very strange directions that relied on local landmarks in Edmonton to guide him into her residence. And she would tell Johnny, when you get here, go through the garage, the door will be open, go out the back door, go into the backyard, make your way up to the back of the house, and I will meet you at the back door. And so Johnny definitely thought these directions were very strange, but he was really eager to meet up with Jen, and so he really didn't care. And so he told Jen it was no big deal, he'd happily follow her directions, and then he hopped in the shower and he got himself together, and then before he left to go to Jen's house, he forwarded Jen's email that included her very strange directions. He sent those directions to one of his very close friends, and he kind of jokingly included a message that was like, hey, if I go missing tonight, this is where I'm going. And then Johnny hopped in his car and he left. The directions brought Johnny to the same garage in the same alleyway that Giles had been to a week earlier. And when Johnny came to a stop in front of Jen's two-car garage with one of the doors partially open, he saw there were lights still on inside of the garage, and he saw someone walking around inside. And so Johnny looked at his watch and he realized he was maybe 15 or 20 minutes too early, and so he parks his car and he's thinking, okay, Jen might be inside of this garage and I'm early, but maybe I'll just walk over and say hi to her. I'm sure she wouldn't mind. And so Johnny turns off his car, he gets out, and he starts walking over to this half-open garage door, and as he gets closer and closer, the lights in the garage go off. And so Johnny stops and he's thinking, why are the lights off? Did she hear me? Does she not want me to come in? What's going on? But he's thinking, okay, well, I should definitely go over and say something. And so he walks over to this open garage door and he bends down and he looks inside and it's totally dark. And he just says, hello? And there's a pause, and then the lights come on, and Johnny suddenly sees this garage that's basically devoid of anything, minus a table off to the side, and every surface is covered in plastic sheeting. The floors, the walls, the ceiling, everything. And in the back of the garage is not Jen. Instead, it's this man he doesn't recognize. And so Johnny's looking at this man, and this man is looking over at Johnny, and finally the man speaks and says, hi, I'm Harry. I'm a designer. I rent this garage out from Jen. And I just talked to Jen, and you're meeting up with her tonight, right? You're meeting up with Jen? Yeah. She's running late. So I think she'll be back in about maybe 20 minutes. So can you come back in 20 minutes, come right back here, come to the garage, and I'll bring you up to the house because I know you're meeting her up at the house. So 20 minutes. And so Johnny doesn't really know what to make of this. He figures, okay, I don't really know what Jen's arrangement is with this designer in this plastic covered garage, but whatever. And so Johnny says, okay, no problem. I'll come back in 20 minutes. And so Johnny turns around and he walks back to his car and he leaves and drives around for about 20 minutes. And then he comes back to the garage. And as soon as he parks, he notices right away the light in the garage is now off. So presumably Harry has actually left. And so he will not be available to walk Johnny up to the house to meet Jen. But Johnny was thinking, I don't really want to interact with Harry. He seems like a strange guy anyways. And so he counts this as a win. And so Johnny parks his car, he hops out, he walks over to the garage, he bends down and goes inside of the garage. He stands up and he walks across the plastic lined floor to the door that's going to lead out into Jen's backyard. But before he reaches that door, something smashes into the back of his head. And immediately Johnny is horribly dazed and he instinctively throws his hands up up to protect his head, and he begins spinning around trying to figure out who or what had just hit him. And as soon as he turns around, he sees in the shadows is the figure of none other than the man he saw before, Harry. And Harry is holding a big metal pipe. And immediately when Johnny sees him, he begins screaming, "Police, police, police!" And Harry just winds up and wails on Johnny with this metal pipe. And Johnny's trying to turn around and get away from Harry, but Harry just keeps moving around him and beating him with this pipe until finally Johnny collapses on the ground, but he's not unconscious. And so Johnny is kind of shielding his head and he's looking up at Harry, who's now just standing over him. He's ceased his initial barrage. And Johnny begins pleading with Harry, I'll give you money. I'll give you anything. Just please let me go. And so Harry smiles and he says, "You promise you won't tell anyone if I let you go?" But before Johnny could answer this, Harry winds up with his pipe and he brings it crashing down on Johnny's face. But amazingly, this does not knock Johnny unconscious. Instead, Johnny grabs the pipe after it hits him in the head and he holds onto it to prevent Harry from hitting him again. And so at this point, Harry is frustrated that Johnny is still putting up this huge fight. And so with one hand holding onto this pipe that Johnny has the other end of, Harry reaches down with his other hand and he unsheaths a hunting knife. And he holds the blade right in front of Johnny's face. And as soon as Johnny sees this knife, his eyes go wide and he lets go of the pipe and he begins to plead for his life. But Harry just smiles and continues to show him the blade. And then at some point he grabs Johnny's shoulder, he pulls the knife back and he plunges it into Johnny's stomach. Johnny howls out in pain and he curls over and he begins screaming for the police, screaming for someone to help him. And then finally Harry pulls the knife out of his stomach and then plunges it into the side of Johnny's neck. And then Harry lets go of the knife and he stands up and he just watches Johnny as he bleeds out onto the plastic lining. As Harry watched Johnny die, he had this pang of regret. He thought to himself, why didn't I play more mind games with him before I killed him? I'll do that with the next one. After Johnny died, Harry would dismember and bag up Johnny's body, and then he would roll up all of the plastic from the walls and the ceiling. He'd gather that all up, and then a couple of days later, he would dump both Johnny's body parts and all of the plastic containing all of the evidence down a nearby sewer drain. At this point in the story, Mark's script just kind of comes to an abrupt end. We don't know what Harry did after getting rid of Johnny's body and the evidence because Mark just didn't write it. It was like he didn't finish the script. And there's a reason for that, and it's the same reason the police stepped in and stopped Mark from making this script into a movie. At the time they read his script, the police had already figured out who owned the garage where Giles and Johnny were attacked. Johnny's friend, the one who Johnny had forwarded Jen's email that had those strange directions, well, that friend gave those directions to the police once Johnny had been reported missing. And so the police followed these strange directions to this garage, and they discovered it was not owned by some young, beautiful blonde named Jen or Sheena. It was not owned by some designer named Harry. It was owned by a young, up-and-coming filmmaker named Mark Twitchell. But to this point, Mark had been extremely cooperative with police and allowed them to search it, and they found nothing. And he explained to them he was not remotely the only person with access to this garage, not by a long shot. But when police searched Mark's laptop, they found a hidden document, and this document was his 42-page script. And when they read it, they saw there was a huge issue. Giles, the first victim of the Edmonton killer, had eventually gotten over his embarrassment and shame, and he went to the Edmonton police and he told them in detail what happened to him inside of that garage. But Giles was so scared he had not told anybody else what had happened. The only people who knew were himself and the Edmonton police. Yet somehow, in Mark's script, the account of what happened to Giles was exactly correct. Every little detail of what happened to Giles was encompassed inside of this script. And the reason Mark had this information is because Mark was in the garage when Giles got attacked. Because Mark was the Edmonton killer. Mark had been so desperate to make his killer in his new movie as good as Dexter in the TV show that Mark decided he needed to literally become Dexter in real life. He needed to know exactly what it felt like to lure an unsuspecting victim into a kill room and murder them so that he'd be able to more accurately write about it in his script. He believed this would put his movie over the top. It would be the most authentic killer movie ever, and it would be his ticket to Hollywood. And so after Mark used a fake dating profile to trap and then attack Giles, after that experience, he wrote about it, and that became his script. And then when he did the same thing to Johnny and then actually successfully killed and disposed of him, he sat down and wrote about that experience too and tacked it on to the end of the Giles attack. He was literally living his movie and writing the script in real time. The title that Mark gave his script was SK Confessions, which stood for Serial Killer Confessions. And that's exactly what the script was. It was a real confession. And based on the way his script just kind of abruptly ends without any sort of conclusion, it seems fairly obvious that Mark was planning to kill more people and then incorporate those experiences into this script. Ultimately, though, the script that was found by police was used to convict Mark of murder, and he is currently serving life in prison. So that's going to do it, guys. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, please sneak into the Like Button's house and replace all of the lids of their Tupperware with off-market brands so none of them fit. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 1 or 2 video uploads. We are now selling merchandise like flannels and hats and sweatshirts and all sorts of stuff. If you're interested, go to shopmrballen.com. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's just MrBallen. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is also MrBallen. We also have a second YouTube channel just called MrBallen Shorts where we post random short videos and lost episodes. We also have a Facebook page just called MrBallen where we post condensed versions of the longer episodes you see on YouTube. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, Facebook, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support, and until next time, that's going to do it. See ya. Larry Bader was living with his wife, Mary Lou, and their 3 kids in Akron, Ohio. Larry was a good father and good husband, but he was a terrible businessman. Over the past several years, he had launched several new business ventures, and they had all failed, throwing the family into fairly significant debt. And so even though Larry desperately wanted to be an entrepreneur and eventually start a quality business, they didn't have the money to do that. And so he had to just take some job in order to pay the bills. And so the job he got was a cookware salesman for a local company, and it did pay the bills, but it did not make Larry happy. And so on the weekends when Larry was not working, and if it was okay with his wife, he would basically just disappear and go fishing on Lake Erie, which is about an hour north of where they lived. And that was his way of kind of disconnecting from reality and kind of disconnecting from his somewhat crappy life. And so on Friday, March 15th, Larry approached his wife and said, hey, I'd like to head up to Lake Erie and go fishing for the weekend. And she would tell him, I got the kids, it's fine, you can go do that, but I heard the weather was going to be really bad. Are you sure that's such a good idea? And Larry would tell her, you know what, don't worry about it. These storms, they always hype them up. They're never a big deal. I'll be fine. And so he kissed his wife, he kissed his kids, he grabbed his stuff, he hopped in his truck, and he left and headed up to Lake Erie. That night, Lake Erie was hit with a massive thunderstorm, way bigger than the one that the news was predicting. And then the following morning, the Coast Guard discovered Larry's boat floating around on Lake Erie. There was minor damage to it, and it was missing an oar, and it was missing Larry. Larry was nowhere to be found. And so a search was launched for Larry, but he was never found, and he was eventually declared dead. And so even though the family did not have Larry's body, they would hold a funeral for him, and his wife was able to actually cash his life insurance policy, which was enough to pay for her and the kids. 8 years later, in 1965, Larry Bader's niece, a 21-year-old woman named Suzanne Peka, was in Chicago at a sporting goods show with a friend of hers. And as they're walking through the different exhibits, looking at different sporting goods equipment, they noticed over on the side of the building, there was a fairly large group of people gathered around this one particular exhibit. And so she and her friend she was with walked over to this group, and they kind of pushed their way through. And in the middle of this group was this man with an eye patch and a big mustache doing an archery demonstration. Basically, he was shooting arrows into a target about 30 feet away. And so Suzanne and her friend just kind of watched this guy for a couple of minutes, and very quickly they could see why he was attracting this big crowd, because he was just an incredible archer. He was hitting the bullseye over and over and over again. But as they continued to watch this guy, Suzanne's friend started to notice something unique about him. And he eventually turned to Suzanne and said, "Hey, doesn't this guy look exactly like your uncle who went missing on Lake Erie?" And Suzanne was kind of surprised to hear him talking about her missing uncle, but she turned and looked at this guy, and all of a sudden she saw it too. He was a spitting image of Larry Bader, her uncle, although this guy had an eye patch and a mustache, but even with that, he looked exactly like Larry. And as Suzanne is watching him, she's thinking, Larry was known for being this incredible archer, and here this guy is who looks just like him, and he's an incredible archer. And so after this demonstration was over, Suzanne and the friend ran over to this guy with the eye patch on, and Suzanne says to him, "Hey, I know this sounds totally crazy, but you look exactly like my uncle, Larry Bader, who went missing on Lake Erie 8 years ago." And so the guy, he hears her and he kind of smiles and says, "I'm sorry, I don't know Larry Bader. My name is John Johnson. People call me Fritz. I'm sorry, I don't know who your uncle is. I can't help you." But Suzanne, as she stood there staring at this guy, she was becoming more and more convinced this was Larry Bader, despite the fact this guy is saying he is not Larry Bader. And so she says to him, "No, you are Larry Bader. I'm positive you're my uncle." Now at this, Fritz would be polite but firm, and he would reiterate that, "Look, I'm not your uncle. I don't know who Larry Bader is. I don't go to Lake Erie. I just don't understand why you think I'm him. I live in Omaha, Nebraska with my wife and my kids, and I'm on TV. I do sports journalism in Omaha, and I advise archery companies, and that's why I'm here. So I don't know why you think I'm your uncle, but I'm not. I'm sorry." And with that, Fritz turned around and he walked away. And after this discussion, Suzanne and her friend were not remotely deterred from what Fritz was saying. They were completely convinced this was Larry Bader. And so they ran to a phone, and Suzanne called her two other uncles, so Larry Bader's brothers, and she explained how she met this guy that is the spitting image of their brother. And they immediately hopped on a flight that night and flew to Chicago. And the following morning, the two uncles, along with Suzanne and her friend, they went back to the sporting goods show. They went over to the archery exhibit, and sure enough, there was Fritz doing his archery demonstration. And as soon as there was a break, Suzanne, her friend, and now the two uncles, so Larry Bader's brothers, they walk over, and the two uncles, as soon as they see this guy, despite the eye patch, despite the mustache, they too would say, "This is our brother." And so they approached him and they said, "Look, I know you're saying you are not our brother. I don't know what's going on here, but you look exactly like our brother, and we have his military paperwork right here with fingerprints. Will you please just humor us and go to the police station with us and get fingerprinted? That way you can prove you really are not our brother. Please, we've been looking for our brother for a long time. This would be a huge favor to us." And so Fritz was annoyed. He didn't want to do it, but he's like, "Okay, fine. I'll go to the police station with you. I'll get my fingerprints taken, and we can put this behind us." And so that day they left the sporting goods show. They went to a police station, and Fritz had his fingerprints taken. And afterwards, the police would tell him, "You are Larry Bader." When Fritz heard this, he could not believe it. I mean, he literally did not believe he was Larry Bader. It wasn't like this revelation prompted new memories and suddenly he recalled it all. It was really the opposite. Fritz immediately is trying to rack his brain to figure out, like, is my whole life a lie? But there was nothing. All he had was a contiguous stretch of memories from when he was a very young child as Fritz Johnson all the way to the present. But we now know that the bulk of his memories are all not real. He was never a child as Fritz Johnson. He was Larry Bader and then became Fritz Johnson only 8 years earlier. The timeline of what happened to Larry Bader is rough at best. But as far as we understand it, Fritz Johnson showed up in Omaha, Nebraska a couple of days or a couple of months after Larry Bader went missing on Lake Erie. And when Fritz showed up in Omaha, he just walked into a restaurant and asked for a job there, and he had provided documentation that showed he was in fact Fritz Johnson, and nobody thought anything of it. He was completely normal. There was nothing unusual about his behavior, and over time, Fritz just kind of thread himself into the Omaha community. I mean, he got married, he had a child, he adopted another child, he left his job as a bartender at a restaurant and eventually got this amazing job as a sports TV broadcaster for their local channel. channel. I mean, he was like a minor celebrity in Omaha. Everybody recognized, oh, there's Fritz Johnson. He's on TV. Hey, Fritz, how you doing? I mean, he had a full-blown life. But as soon as the news broke that he was not Fritz Johnson, he was Larry Bader, right away, the TV station he worked for fired him. His second wife left him because in reality, he actually was still legally married to his first wife. And so his marriage to his second wife was never actually real to begin with. And so she leaves him. And then also because Larry Bader was no longer dead, the insurance company that had paid out all that money to his first wife as part of his life insurance policy, they demanded that he repay them. And throughout all this drama of Fritz finding out he's Larry Bader, Fritz continued to say he was not Larry Bader, that this was all a big mistake. He just could not understand how this could have happened. None of it made sense. And so eventually a team of experts, doctors, psychologists, you name it, they came out to Omaha and they ran Fritz, aka Larry Bader, through a battery of tests over almost 2 weeks. And at the end of all their testing, they concluded that one, Fritz definitely is Larry Bader. So there's no debate there. He is Larry Bader. And two, he is almost certainly suffering from an extreme case of amnesia, which is memory loss. But the doctors and experts had no idea how he developed this case of amnesia. And of course, Fritz, he too had no idea how he developed this case of amnesia. And it's unlikely we'll ever get any more clarity on exactly what happened to Larry Bader / Fritz, because unfortunately, just 1 year after it was discovered Fritz was Larry Bader, Fritz would die. He had cancer in one of his eyes, and that was actually why he wore that eye patch, and the cancer had come back and it took his life. Today, his case is considered to be one of the most believable and baffling cases of amnesia on record. Before we get into our next story, I want to talk to you about today's sponsor, HelloFresh. Back during the beginning of the pandemic, we were not able to get groceries or have food delivered to our house. And so before long, we were down to eating just the Diet Cheetos and pickled licorice. And as I was eating my 77th bag of Diet Cheetos, I thought to myself, is there anything better for me to eat? And that's when I discovered HelloFresh. HelloFresh is like one of those things where as soon as you have it, you think to yourself, how could I have ever lived without this? They send you this neat little box full of meals, and there's all these incredible meals to choose from fairly intricate to very quick and easy. And so whatever your tastes are, they got it. But the catch is, they are not made. You are the chef and you make the meals. And before you tell me that you're a bad chef, I'm a bad chef, and I'm able to whip these meals together no problem because all the ingredients are perfectly proportioned, which also means you don't waste any food, and the recipes are incredibly easy to follow. So the end product is home-cooked, fresh, delicious food every time. So if your New Year's resolution is to eat better or to just stop snarfing as many Diet Cheetos, then you really need to sign up for HelloFresh. To do that, go to HelloFresh.com, use the code MrBallen16 to get up to 16 free meals and 3 surprise gifts. Okay, back to the stories. Just outside of the popular tourist town of Amaga in northern Colombia lies this thick green jungle. And if you know where to look, there is actually a walking path that leads you from Amaga deep into this jungle. And if you keep going, it will bring you all the way to this terrifying, enormous old railroad bridge that spans this huge ravine. Now, this bridge is no longer used by trains. It's been decommissioned. However, since its decommissioning, there's actually been, ironically, more traffic on this bridge, although it is the foot traffic variety. People come out to this bridge to go bungee jumping. Bungee jumping is a thrill-seeking activity where people will leap off of high places, like this bridge, and they'll jump with an elastic rope tied to their ankles. And so this rope has been very carefully measured so that when it is fully stretched all the way out, it ensures whoever has jumped will still not impact the ground. Back in early July of 2021, a 25-year-old Colombian lawyer named Yesenia Gomez, who lived about an hour north of Amaga in the larger city of Medellin, she told her boyfriend that she wanted to go bungee jumping. This was something Yesenia had talked about for a long time, wanting to go bungee jumping, but every time it became a real thing and they were actually going to go do it, she would back down because she was just too scared. But for whatever reason, in July of 2021, Yesenia had the confidence and the courage to actually see this thing through. And so her boyfriend, when he heard how serious she was, he capitalized on the opportunity because he had never bungee jumped before and he really wanted to, but he couldn't without his girlfriend. And so now it seemed like she was serious. And so right away, he called the Amaga bungee jumping company to book a slot for he and Yesenia to jump off of their bridge. So on the day they were supposed to jump, which was Sunday, July 18th, Yesenia and her boyfriend hopped in their car and they drove an hour south to Amaga. And when they got there, they found the walking trail and they made their way out to this bridge. And when they get out to this bridge, they are amazed at the number of people who were already in line on this bridge waiting to jump off of it. They knew this was a popular spot, but perhaps they didn't realize just how popular it was. And so Yesenia and her boyfriend, they get in line behind the nearly 100 other jumpers ahead of them, and they proceed to wait. And over the next several hours, Yesenia and her boyfriend would have front row seats to all of the jumpers ahead of them jumping off the bridge. Now, it seems like Yesenia, in her mind, believed she would arrive at this bridge and very quickly she and her boyfriend would leap off and it would be great and so much fun. But now they've been forced to wait for a really long time. And this whole time, they're watching other people jump. And Yesenia is starting to panic. Suddenly, bungee jumping looked terrifying. It did not look like something she wanted to do. And so she was beginning to second guess her decision. And so her boyfriend, he's trying to calm her down and he's telling her, oh, it's totally safe. Look at all these people who have jumped. They're all fine. They're all smiling. They're so happy. You're going to be so proud of yourself. But despite his best efforts to calm his girlfriend down, Yesenia just could not calm down. But she did tell her boyfriend that she's not about to back down. She's going to go through with this. And so several hours went by of this totally high stress, anxious waiting period. And then finally, Yesenia and her boyfriend reached the front of the line, at which point the staff members who've been doing this all day long, they signal the two to step forward and get their harnesses on. And so Yesenia and her boyfriend, they make their way to the edge of the platform. So they're looking out over this ravine and the staff members are putting on their harnesses and getting them ready. And the whole time, Yesenia, she's starting to get tunnel vision. Her heart is racing. She's totally panicked. She doesn't think this is fun at all. She just wants to get this over with. And then at some point, one of the staff members finally says, okay, jump. And so Yesenia jumps. Except it would turn out Yesenia had made a mistake. That staff member who had said, okay, jump, was talking to her boyfriend, not Yesenia. However, Yesenia, in her totally panicked state, had just not understood and had leapt, believing they were telling her to jump. However, the staff members had only put her harness on. They had not attached the actual elastic rope to her ankles. And so when Yesenia jumped, there was nothing stopping her from smashing into the ground. And so as soon as she leapt off the bridge, her boyfriend ripped off all of his gear and he ran down the bridge. He leapt over the railing and he ran down the hillside all the way to the bottom of this ravine. But when he finally got to his girlfriend, it was already too late. She was already gone. It would later be determined Yesenia did not die from impacting the ground. She actually died from a heart attack she suffered on the fall down, which means she must have realized after she jumped that she jumped too early, that she did not have the bungee cord attached to her legs. And so literally the fear of what was about to happen to her killed her. In early 1974, 31-year-old Michael Taylor was living happily with his wife Christine and their 5 children in Ossett, which is a small town in central England. Michael was described as a great father and a great husband who had an excellent sense of humor. In fact, neighbors, whenever they would walk past the Taylor household, would say you could often hear the sound of Michael laughing or the sound of him telling jokes to his family. But in April of that year, everything changed for the Taylor family. Michael had been doing some home repairs when he fell off of a ladder and he hurt his back. The injury itself was fairly minor, but it resulted in chronic pain. And this chronic pain quickly changed how Michael behaved. Michael went from being this cheerful, funny, happy guy to being sad and depressed. And he was so irritable that his family could barely be around him because he would lash out at them. Now, the Taylor family was not a religious family. However, most families who lived in Ossett at that time were. And so when one of Michael's friends found out about how poorly Michael was doing, they approached Michael and said, you know, you really ought to turn to religion for help and for guidance in this difficult time. And they also told him specifically that he really ought to check out this one particular Christian group. It was called the Christian Fellowship Group, and all it was a prayer group for Christians who wanted more religious support beyond just going to church on Sundays. But this friend of Michael's told him that the real draw of this group was the group's leader. Her name was Marie Robinson, and she was this 21-year-old, extremely friendly and energetic and charismatic person who just had this incredible way of making all of her members really feel like they belonged. And so Michael's friend was telling him that he really thought Marie could be the difference maker for him, that she could help him get back to normal. And so Michael, you know, he trusted this friend, and he really didn't have much to lose at this point. He was already at rock bottom, and so he agrees to go check this group out. So on September 12th of that year, Michael makes his way to the church where this fellowship group is held. He goes inside and he makes his way to one of the back rooms in the church. And when he goes inside, he sees there's a ring of people sitting in a circle, about 20 people. And as soon as they see Michael coming in the room, they all stand up and they open their arms up and they say, come on, come sit down with us. Welcome to the group. And then the woman who had to be Marie, she stands up and she looks at Michael, huge smile on her face, and she encourages him to come over and sit right next to me. Welcome. We'd love to have you join our group. And so Michael, for the first time in ages, is smiling as he strides across the room and sits down right next to Marie. And then as Marie began to lead the group in prayer, Michael did not feel his chronic pain. He just felt happy again. But when the meeting was over and Michael went back home again, the pain and depression came flooding back. It was like the only place he could be happy was inside of the church at this fellowship group. And so over the next couple of weeks, Michael completely prioritized this group. He went to all of their meetings, and over the course of these couple of weeks, Michael became very close with Marie, and apparently Marie became very close with Michael, to the point where the two of them would stay after the meetings were over, and just those two would sequester themselves in quiet prayer. No one knew what they did in there, but it just seemed like they were developing a real relationship. And in fact, many people in this group suspected they were having an affair. And before long, the rumors in the church had spread outside and were all over Ossett. And then before long, Christine, Michael's wife, was hearing from a friend or a neighbor that apparently Michael was having an affair with Marie. Now, Christine had already suspected her husband was having an affair with Marie because Marie was the only thing Michael talked about when he got home. So on October 1st of that year, only a couple of weeks after Michael had first attended this group, Christine waited until Michael had left the house to head out to one of the group meetings, and then Christine hopped in her car and she followed him to the church. And when she got there, she parked her car, she took a deep breath, and then she got out, she made her way to the front doors of the church, and she stormed inside, and she found the room where these meetings were held. She barges in, and she points at her husband, and she says, I know you're having an affair with Marie, and you're going to admit it in front of this whole group. And Michael, who's sitting with his back to his wife in one of the chairs, he stands up, and instead of addressing his wife, who's accused him of infidelity, he turns and looks at Marie on the other side of the room. And when Marie made eye contact with Michael, she screamed. She would later say Michael did not look human. He looked like a beast, and he had wild eyes. And so as Michael is standing there staring at Marie with this very aggressive face, he began breaking out in tongues. Speaking in tongues is where the speaker will be saying or uttering words or sounds that sound like language, but the speaker doesn't know what they mean. The idea is some entity has come inside of their body, and this entity is dictating their speech. And so Michael is broken out in tongues. He's barking these words and sounds at Marie, and everyone inside of the room has no idea what to make of this. Everything has happened so suddenly, and it's so surprising. You have the wife suddenly coming in and aggressively accusing her husband of cheating, and Michael is not responding to it, and he's acting totally crazy. And then before anyone can do anything, Michael goes from just barking in strange languages at Marie to suddenly rushing across the room as if he's going to attack her. And when he does that, the rest of the members jump on top of him and hold him down. And despite there being like 10 or 15 people holding him down, Michael is still trying to get up, and he's screaming and snarling and yelling at Marie. And then Marie suddenly breaks out into tongues too. And it's only then that Michael stops trying to force himself up out of this pig pile that's on top of him. And instead, he just continues to speak in tongues to her. And so the two of them are looking at each other, speaking in tongues, and the rest of the group is just totally dumbfounded. And so they just begin praying. And then after about an hour, Michael just collapses. It's like he went unconscious. And at that point, everybody in the room just goes silent and they look at Michael. And then Michael kind of opens his eyes and it's almost like he's waking up, and he begins looking around frantically, trying to figure out what had just happened. Michael would claim he had no memory of what had just happened to him. And so at this point, Marie would tell him and Christine that she believed Michael was possessed by a demonic force, and the only thing they could do at this point would be to perform an exorcism. An exorcism is an expulsion or attempted expulsion of a supposedly evil spirit inside of a person or a place. Michael and Christine were at a loss. They had no idea what to do in this situation. They were both kind of in shock for very different reasons. And so they just kind of deferred to Marie's judgment and said, yeah, I think an exorcism is the way to go. So Christine and Michael just leave the church and go home. And then the next morning, Marie would get in touch with the Anglican Church of England and would request an exorcism. And after hearing about what was going on with Michael, the Anglican Church would say, yeah, that does sound like he needs an exorcism. And so the following day, they would send out two of their best exorcists named Peter and Raymond. And so Peter and Raymond, they get to Ossett, they go to Michael's house and they observe him. And very quickly, they determine that it does seem like Michael is possessed by at least one demonic force. And so they tell Michael, the only thing we can do here is perform this exorcism, but we need you to agree to it. And so Michael says, okay, yeah, I agree to this exorcism. And so would his wife, because she at this point is just completely unsure what to do. She's just going along for the ride. So a day later, on October 4th at 10 p.m., Michael, his wife, and the rest of the members of this fellowship group, along with Peter and Raymond, they would all meet at this other church in a neighboring town. And as soon as Michael had been positioned in the middle of this group in this chair, Peter and Raymond began the ritual by praying. And as soon as they did, Michael began screaming out in tongues, and he began writhing around, and he fell to the ground, and he began contorting his body in grotesque positions, as if the words Peter and Raymond were saying were physically harming Michael. And so after 8 hours of this, during which they had to actually tie Michael down to prevent him from hurting other members or hurting himself, after 8 hours, they finally just came to a stop. Peter and Raymond were exhausted. It looked very much like Michael too was exhausted. And as soon as they stopped the ritual, Michael just kind of collapsed on the ground as if he had fallen unconscious. And then at some point he kind of wakes up and he's looking around wildly. He's still tied down to the ground and he's acting like he has no idea what's just happened. And at this point, Peter and Raymond, they tell him that, the exorcism was mostly successful. We identified 40 demons inside of you, and this exorcism was able to expel 37 of them. So that means there's still 3 demons inside of you. Now, we can't do it right now. We're too tired. You're too exhausted. So go home, get some rest, and tomorrow we will finish this exorcism. We will get rid of those 3 demons, and you will be just fine. And so Michael and Christine, they get their things, and they leave the church, and they head home. A few hours later, around noon, a woman who lived near where Michael Taylor and his family lived thought she heard something strange outside of her house. It sounded like someone yelling. And so she went to the front of the house and she pulled the curtain aside on one of her windows. And outside, walking down the street completely naked, covered in blood, was Michael Taylor, and he was saying something about Satan. And so this woman, she calls the police show up, and they find Michael. He had curled up on the sidewalk outside of this woman's house, and he was giggling like a child in the fetal position. And so the police approach him, and at some point, Michael apparently snaps out of it, and he starts looking up at the police like he has no idea what's going on, and eventually they would get him to tell them his name and where he lived. And so after calling in backup to deal with Michael, the responding officers made their way to Michael's residence. And so they go inside, and immediately, as soon as they see what's in there, one of the officers just turns around and runs outside and begins dry heaving. The inside of the Taylor family home would become one of the most infamous crime scenes in English history. A few hours earlier, when Michael and his wife had come home from the exorcism, they had gone inside, and then Michael had fallen into one of his trances and began beating his wife. And then at some point, she fell to the ground and either was dead or was in the process of dying, at which point Michael jumped on top of her, and using only his hands, he ripped her face off and flung it across the room. And then as she's laying there bleeding to death, he began rubbing her blood all over his body. And then after she had finally died, he tracked down the family dog and killed the dog as well. Fortunately, their 5 children were not home at the time of this attack, and so they were unharmed. During Michael's trial, the prosecution and the defense blamed the Anglican Church of England and Marie and her religious group for effectively convincing Michael he was possessed with demons, which caused him to act out violently and kill his wife. And so ultimately, Michael would be found not guilty by reason of insanity, and after only 4 years of psychiatric care, he was released. And today, he is still living free in Ossett. But despite the legal outcomes of this case, there are many people, both religious and not religious, who believe the Michael Taylor case is one of the only true demonic possession cases in modern history. Also, just to close the loop, we don't know for sure if Michael and Marie were having an affair, but it is assumed they were. And so that's going to do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's episode, let us know in the comments section what it is and where you found it. So give us the timestamp. And if you're the first to do that, we'll pin you at the top of the comments section. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, please go to the like button's place of work 1 minute before closing time and then proceed to browse around for about 30 minutes and then leave without buying anything. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 1 or 2 video uploads. We are now selling merchandise like flannels and hats and sweatshirts and all sorts of stuff. If you're interested, go to shopmrballen.com. If you want to learn about upcoming deals and promotions for our shop, go to our shop's Instagram page. The username is shopmrballen. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's just MrBallen. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is also MrBallen. We also have a second YouTube channel just called MrBallen Shorts where we post random short videos and lost episodes. We also have a Facebook page just called MrBallen where we post condensed versions of the longer episodes you see on YouTube. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, Facebook, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it. See ya. Madre Oriental is a major mountain range that starts on the southern border of Texas and Mexico and cuts 700 miles south through the northeastern section of Mexico. About halfway down this mountain range on the eastern face lies a series of caves, and situated below these caves at the foot of the mountains are several small villages that are very isolated, and they're populated primarily with illiterate poor farmers. One night back in May of 1963, a 14-year-old boy named Sebastian Guerrero, who lived in one of these small isolated villages, decided to go for a walk up in the mountains, and he wanted to go explore the different caves. Now, this was something he did fairly regularly because there was a local rumor that there was actually hidden treasure in these different caves. Now, it's unclear if Sebastian literally believed that or if that was just kind of an excuse to go have a look around himself. But regardless, he headed out of his house and he began walking up the mountain towards these caves. The entrance to these caves were a couple hundred feet up the mountainside, and then each of the various entrances, which ranged in size from fairly small to enormous, were spread out a couple of miles in each direction. So Sebastian starts walking up the mountain towards the first entrance he can see. It's dark outside. He's got no flashlight. He's just walking up. And as he's walking, he notices off to his right, fairly far away from where he was, there was light coming out of one of the cave entrances. And he had never recalled seeing light coming out of any of these caves. Nobody ever went in these caves, especially not at night. And so his interest was piqued, and he decided he would kind of abandon his original plan to just kind of look around near his village, and he would actually walk all the way over to that lit up cave and see what was going on. So he turned right and began kind of walking uphill at an angle in the direction of this lit up cave. And so as he's walking, he's getting farther and farther away from the village where he lives, and he's starting to hear sounds coming out of this lit up cave entrance. It sounds like a person potentially, either they're laughing or they're screaming. He doesn't really know. He's thinking, maybe someone's having a party inside one of these caves. He has no idea. But after he gets maybe 200 or 300 feet away from this entrance, he realizes it's definitely a person, and they're definitely screaming. And it does not sound like they're screaming out of joy. It sounds like they're screaming because they're scared or they're in pain. And as he's getting closer and closer and closer to this cave, his anxiety is starting to ramp up because he's really starting to be frightened by what he's hearing. And he's starting to realize there's more than one person inside of this cave. In addition to the person that is screaming out, there also sounds to be a large contingent of other people that are either singing in unison or chanting in unison, but some group of people are doing something in unison while some other person is screaming out. And so he's really starting to get nervous about this cave, but he just can't help feeling curious about what was going on. And so he just continued walking until he was maybe 10 feet away from the entrance to this cave, and he plopped down behind a rock. And so he's not really sure if it's a good idea to look. He doesn't want to be spotted by whoever is in there, but finally he kind of works up the courage. He takes a deep breath and he slips out from behind the rock, and he goes right to the edge of this big opening, maybe 10 foot across opening, and he peeks his head right around the edge of the opening, and he looks inside, and what he sees causes him to just freeze in terror. Then his survival instincts just kick in, and he turns and he starts running down the mountain away from this cave. He has no idea if he's been spotted or not, but he's sensing that someone could be chasing him, and so he is just running as if his life depended on it. And he would not run back to his village. Instead, he would run nearly 10 miles to the nearest police station. And when he gets there, he busts through the front doors and he's totally hysterical. He's drenched in sweat, and the police officers are totally caught off guard, and so they're trying to tell him to calm down. And so Sebastian finally would kind of compose himself, but then he just was not able to describe what he had seen inside of this cave. Whatever he had seen, he knew it was bad, but the words were just escaping him. And so the way he described it to police was he basically thought he saw vampires. And as soon as he began describing vampires to the police, they're thinking to themselves, okay, I don't know what's going on with this kid, but this just cannot be serious. And so they consoled him and kind of calmed him down and said, look, kid, I don't know what you're talking about. If there's any news that comes out of something happening in the cave that's bad, I'm sure we'll hear about it and we'll follow up. But for now, we're just going to bring you back to your village. And so at this, Sebastian was really frustrated, and he was kind of pleading with the police, like, no, you got to take me seriously. There's something bad happening in this cave. Someone could be hurt. Someone could be dying. I don't know, but you got to go to this cave. You got to go see what's going on. But the police at this point, they're just not really interested. And so they ultimately do just drive him back to his village. And so he goes back into his home. The police go back to their station, and everyone just kind of goes to bed for the night. The next day, when Sebastian wakes up, he just can't shake what he saw inside of that cave. And so he would once again run back to the police station. And when he got there, he began pleading with the police, like, you gotta go see what's inside of this cave. I'm telling you, there's something awful in there. And this time, one of the police officers, his name was Luis Martinez, he would say, okay, kid, bring me to this cave and I'll have a look around. And so Luis and Sebastian, who was very grateful, they left the police station, they hopped in a police car, and they took off. And then later on in the day, the other police officers, who were not really paying attention to this cave thing, they realized that Luis and the boy had not returned yet, and Luis had not checked in via his radio. And so at some point in the afternoon that day, the other officers began calling out to Luis. They began calling him on his radio and trying to figure out what's going on, but he wasn't responding. And so the police thought that was odd, but they thought, you know what, I'm sure he'll be back soon. There's got to be an explanation for this. But the rest of the day would go by without Luis reaching out to them, and he didn't return with the boy. And so by that evening, the other officers were genuinely concerned that, something bad had happened to their colleague. And so they tried calling Luis a few more times on the radio. It didn't work. And so the officers, they made their way over to Sebastian's village, and they found Sebastian's family, believing that, maybe the boy was back and he could give some insight into where Luis went. But when they talked to Sebastian's family, they would say, hey, he's not back yet either. And so both Sebastian and Luis at this point have not talked to anyone all day, and they are missing. And so the police at this point, they realized this is an emergency. They need to figure out where these two went. And so they were kind of understaffed. And so they contacted the Mexican army, and they explained, we're missing one of our colleagues. We're missing a child from this village. And so the Mexican army would actually send out a military unit to assist them in going and finding these two people. And so the unit, they show up later that night, and the police and the Mexican army, they head out to where this cave was. And when they saw what was inside the cave, it would shock the world. To understand what was found inside of this cave, we need to go back 6 months to December of 1962. That month, two brothers, Santos and Cayetano Hernandez, who made their living basically traveling around Mexico, stealing from people and swindling people, they decided they were going to pull off their biggest heist yet. they were going to rip off an entire town. Their plan was to go into a small, fairly isolated village that was populated primarily with poor and illiterate people, and they would go in there and they would convince the villagers that they, the brothers, were actually prophets of an exiled Incan god, and if these villagers did everything they said, they would make them rich. And so the village the brothers identified as their target was a place called La Yerba Buena, which was located right at the foot of the Sierra Madre Oriental, right below where that cave was that Luis and Sebastian went to investigate. And La Yerba Buena was exactly what the brothers were looking for. It was home to only about 20 families that were all very poor and illiterate, and they were very suggestible. And so right before the new year, the Hernandez brothers strolled into La Yerba Buena, and they put on this very dramatic show explaining how they were the prophets of the Incan god. And these two brothers, they were very charismatic and they were excellent salesmen. And so they really sold the lie. And these villagers who were very vulnerable and cut off really from the rest of the world, they believed them. They thought this was their big break. They're going to be rich. We just have to do whatever they say. And so almost immediately, the villagers effectively became the Hernandez brothers' slaves. They would give them anything they wanted and do anything they wanted. But after a couple of months of this, some of the villagers started to be frustrated with the Hernandez brothers, the prophets, because it seemed like they were not really working towards making the villagers rich. Instead, it just seemed like they were horribly mistreating the villagers. And it just didn't feel like this was a relationship that was benefiting the villagers. And so when this sentiment began to kind of make its way around the 70-ish people who lived in La Yerba Buena, the brothers picked up on it, and they could have, at that point, just kind of abandoned their gig. At this point, you know, they've robbed the town dry. There's nothing left for them to give to the brothers. But for whatever reason, the brothers decide instead to salvage their operation. And so the brothers, they leave the village and they go to a city that's relatively close by, and they recruit this young woman named Magdalena Solis. She was a prostitute, and they tell her, hey, you know, we have this con we're doing in La Yerba Buena where we're pretending to be prophets of this Incan god, and they're starting not to believe our lie, and so we need you, if you're willing, to come with us and pretend to be an actual Incan goddess. And so when you show up, they'll know that we were serious, that we have a direct line to the Incan gods and goddesses, and they'll believe us again, and they'll fall back in line. And so Magdalena, she likes the idea of participating in this con, and so she agrees to do it in exchange for some money. And so she, along with the Hernandez brothers and Magdalena's brother, his name was Eliezer, and he functioned as her pimp, those four people, they went back to Yerba Buena, and when they got there, the Hernandez brothers snuck Magdalena past all the villagers up to that cave up in the mountains, and they put her in the back of the cave. They kind of hid her behind some rocks, and they dressed her up in an Incan goddess costume. And then once she was in there, the brothers went back down to the village, and they rounded all the villagers up and said, come on, let's go up to the cave. We have a special ceremony for you. And so the villagers made their way up to this cave, and once they were all inside, the Hernandez brothers used some basic magic tricks and created basically a smoke screen. Once they had the smoke screen kind of billowing in the back of the cave, they secretly signaled to Magdalena, who was behind the smoke screen, and she knew that was her cue, and she leapt through the smoke and she presented herself to the villagers for the first time, and she declared herself to be a reincarnated Incan goddess. And if you don't do what I tell you to do, I'm going to kill you. And so the message she was sending to the villagers was so intense, they completely believed that this was an Incan goddess, and therefore this was not a ruse. The brothers were not lying to them. This was all very real. There's a real goddess in front of us. And so they immediately fell right back in line. The plan worked exactly as the brothers wanted it to. However, there was an element of their plan they could not possibly have accounted for, and that was what Magdalena did next. Even though Magdalena was fully aware that what she was getting herself into was an act, it was a con, it was not real, despite that, as soon as she jumped through the smoke and was standing in front of the villagers for the first time and saw the looks on these people's faces as they stared up at her, and she saw their reverence for her, it had this profound impact on her. This is a woman who's never had control in her life. She's been a prostitute since a young age, and here she is, the most powerful person in the room, and it's not even close. And it got to her head. And so when she left the cave that night, She literally believed she was a reincarnated Incan goddess, and she was not a merciful one. Within the first few days of her stay at La Yerba Buena, Magdalena used threats of violence on the villagers to completely take over the village. She very easily supplanted the Hernandez brothers at the top of the power structure. Now, the Hernandez brothers probably were quite surprised to see this happen because they were expecting Magdalena to play more of a prop role to keep them in power, not the other way around. But ultimately, they kind of just went along with it because through Magdalena's control over the villagers, they were able to continue to exploit the villagers. And so they were getting what they wanted out of this relationship. Within a few weeks of being in La Yerba Buena, Magdalena was not only abusing every villager in every horrible way imaginable, she also was becoming completely delusional. She convinced herself that in order to survive, she needed to start drinking blood. And so she demanded all the villagers provide her with blood. And so in fear of retribution, the villagers began slaughtering all of their farm animals and their own pets so Magdalena could drink their blood. For weeks and weeks and weeks, the horrible abuse Magdalena would dole out on the villagers would continue, and these blood rituals would continue. And then finally, sometime in April, two of the villagers decided, you know what? I've had enough. I don't believe Magdalena is actually an Incan goddess. I don't believe the Hernandez brothers are actually prophets. I think this is all a scam. And so they decided the way they would handle this is they were just going to flee the village. Now, somehow their plans to run away got out, and the Hernandez brothers found out about it, and they, in turn, told Magdalena about it. And when she heard the news, she immediately told everyone in the village to make their way up to the cave for a special ceremony. So all the villagers, including the two people that were planning on running away, they made their way up to the cave, and once everyone was inside, Magdalena walked to the front of the group, and she pointed at the two dissenters, the two people that were planning on running, and she demanded that the rest of the villagers kill them. And on the spot, all of the other villagers jumped on top of the two dissenters and they lynched them. They beat them to death in the cave. And then after these two people have been killed, Magdalena orders their bodies be strung up on these two pikes she had set up in the back of the cave because she knew what she was going to be doing up in this cave. And so after these two bodies were strung up on these pikes, Magdalena grabs a chalice and she walks over to these two bodies and she presses the chalice up against their bodies where they're bleeding from, and she fills it up and then she drinks from the chalice. And at this point, everything changed. Suddenly, Magdalena understood that it wasn't good enough to just be drinking animal blood. That was not enough to keep her, a goddess, alive. She now could only consume human blood. And so for the next several weeks, periodically, Magdalena would order everyone in the village to go back up to the cave for a blood ritual, which they all knew what this entailed. This no longer had anything to do with animals. This was human blood rituals. She would order them up and they would have no idea who was going to be the sacrifice. And so all these people, they get inside this dark cave, and then Magdalena shows up and she stands in front of them, and after kind of looking them over, she identifies her next sacrifice, and out of fear, the other villagers, who were the friends and family of the victim, would launch themselves on top of the chosen sacrifice and lynch them in the cave. And then afterwards, their body would be strung up on one of the pikes, and Magdalena would walk over with her chalice. She would fill it with blood and she would drink it. And so this would go on and on for several weeks. And one of the most distressing aspects of these human sacrifices is that as she did more and more and more of them, Magdalena got it in her head that beating the sacrifice to death before consuming their blood was spoiling the blood in some way. And so what she began doing was she would have the other villagers beat the sacrifice into submission, and then she would have the sacrifice strung up to one of the pikes while they were still alive, and then she would carve their heart out while they were alive, and then she would drink their blood. So in May of 1963, when Sebastian, the 14-year-old boy, when he poked his head around and looked into that cave, he watched one of these sacrifices having their heart cut out. And he didn't know what to make of it, and so he ran to the police. And then the next day, he and the police officer, Luis Martinez, they would go back to the cave, and Magdalena and her cult would spot them, capture them, and drag them both into the cave, and both of them would be ritualistically sacrificed. They would have their hearts cut out, and Magdalena would drink their blood. When the police and army arrived in La Yerba Buena, it was a ghost town because all of the villagers had been ordered up to the cave where they had barricaded themselves inside with weapons because Magdalena probably knew there was going to be a big police response because one of their officers has gone missing out here. They're bound to be found out. And so when the police and the army reach the cave, there's this big shootout with all of the villagers. And during the shootout, the majority of the villagers are killed. Also, the Hernandez brothers, they're also killed in the shootout. And then after the shootout stopped, the police and the army would go into this cave and they would discover the pikes, the bloody pikes that are in the back of the cave with bits of human remains all over the ground. And then they would leave the cave and they would search the town and they would find the remains of Luis and Sebastian outside a particular shack. And then inside the shack was Magdalena and her brother Eliezer. They were still alive. They were trying to hide from the authorities. And so they would be arrested. It's believed Magdalena sacrificed and drank the blood of at least 15 of the villagers over a 6-week period. However, the only remains to be positively identified were Luis Martinez and Sebastian Guerrero. Ultimately, Magdalena and her brother Eliezer were sentenced to 50 years in prison, and all of the surviving villagers who participated in these sacrifices or who participated in the shootout with police and the army, they were given 30 years in prison. Amazingly, none of the villagers ever testified against Magdalena or her brother, despite the fact they were almost certainly offered reduced sentences in exchange for their testimony. Clearly, they were more terrified of the Incan goddess than they were terrified of the prospect of 30 years in prison. Although the exact date of when this happened is not known, Magdalena would eventually die behind bars. So that's going to do it, guys. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, please put a single metal fork in the like button's microwave, set it for 99 minutes, hit start, and then leave. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 1 or 2 video uploads. We are now selling merchandise like flannels and hats and sweatshirts and all sorts of stuff. If you're interested, go to shopmrballen.com. If you want to learn about upcoming deals and promotions for our shop, go to our shop's Instagram page. The username is shopmrballen. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's just MrBallen. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is also MrBallen. We also have a second YouTube channel just called MrBallen Shorts where we post random short videos and lost episodes. We also have a Facebook page just called MrBallen where we post condensed versions of the longer episodes you see on YouTube. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, Facebook, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it.